In this video, we'll delve into encounters where individuals assert their rights when dealing with law enforcement officers. Let's explore these situations in greater detail to gain a deeper understanding of the complexities and nuances that can arise during such interactions. Upholding and protecting one's rights when engaging with law enforcement is a fundamental aspect of a democratic society. As we examine these scenarios, we'll highlight the importance of clear communication, mutual respect, and a commitment to upholding the law, which collectively contribute to ensuring that such interactions remain lawful, respectful, and constructive.
You can ask for my identification. I am not legally required to give it to you.
Except that you...
No, I'm not. My attorney has told me so.
I don't care what your attorney told you. You have to identify yourself because we're
My rights
investigating a
are
possible
important to me.
The first scenario opens with a law enforcement officer seemingly on a power trip, attempting to assert authority by requesting identification from individuals without apparent legal justification. The encounter revolves around an individual who refuses to comply with the officer's demands, opting to assert their rights. The officer initiates the exchange by asking the individual for their identification. However, the individual raises a pertinent question: "Have I broken any laws?" The officer's response is rather vague, stating that they're not certain but emphasizing their commitment to public safety. They point out concerns about the individual walking around the property and taking photographs, suspecting potential criminal activity. However, the individual promptly counters this assertion, standing firmly on their knowledge of their rights. They assert that reasonable suspicion is a prerequisite for a lawful detainment and ask for clarification about the reason for their detention. The officer, seemingly short on answers, states that the detention is for identification purposes, a claim met with skepticism by the individual. They firmly educate the officer, emphasizing that breaking a law is the precondition for a legitimate demand for identification. The officer's response to this assertiveness is to call for backup, elevating the situation.
Insurance adjuster?
I possibly might be.
Okay, do you have any proof of that?
Okay, but I mean, why do I have to answer questions? I'm here for a legal reason. I'm just not answering questions.
Can I get your date of birth?
The initial officer has been challenged, and more law enforcement personnel arrive on the scene. The interaction takes a more intense turn as the individual questions the arriving officer's authority, asking if they are the supervisor. This challenge to the officer's authority hits a nerve, causing the officer to assert their authority more firmly. The escalation continues as the officer tells the individual to put away their camera, asserting that they are violating their rights. The individual stands their ground, invoking their right to record the encounter. This defiant act incites the officer's anger and prompts a threat or arrest unless the individual complies with all commands. The situation reveals the power struggle between an individual aware of their rights and an officer intent on asserting their authority. It underscores the importance of understanding one's rights during such encounters and the potential for confrontation when those rights are challenged.
I'm working. Can you please go sit in your car? You have nothing to do with
His
this.
father
I
is
understand.
a minor. I'm an attorney because he's a minor. You need to tell me, is he going to be here?
I don't need to
or
tell
is
you anything. I'm going to arrest you in a second if you don't get in your car.
In the second scenario, the encounter unfolds with an individual asserting their right to remain silent, a powerful form of protest. The encounter takes place as a law enforcement officer exits their vehicle, and the individual immediately tells them to step back. This assertion of personal space sets the tone for the interaction. The officer responds by initiating a series of questions. However, the individual remains silent, choosing not to engage verbally. Their silence becomes a form of protest, asserting their right not to self-incriminate or respond to questions they deem unnecessary or invasive. This tactic of silent dissent can be a powerful way to convey one's objection to the situation. As the officer persists in questioning and engages in a line of inquiry, more law enforcement officers are drawn to the scene. The individual's silence creates a sense of frustration among the officers. The primary officer mentions receiving a complaint about the individual's actions, perhaps as an attempt to elicit a response. The interaction takes a fascinating turn as the female officer expresses fear, advising the individual not to approach. However, the individual stands their ground, asserting their right to be on a public sidewalk, a space explicitly recognized as public property. The situation further escalates as the officers collectively order the individual to place their hands on a nearby vehicle. This order raises questions about the legality of such a demand, especially when the individual is not under suspicion of a specific crime. The individual recognizes the intrusion on their rights and begins to communicate, ensuring that their objections are heard. The individual's voice breaks the silence, emphasizing that they have not violated any laws and are merely exercising their rights to film in a public space. This declaration clarifies their position and the underlying principles they are defending. The officers respond by denying that they are conducting a search and emphasize that they are merely patting down the individual for their safety. The individual remains steadfast, asserting their right to be free from unwarranted searches and seizures. They request the officers' names and badge numbers, reinforcing their commitment to accountability and transparency. This demand for identification aims to hold the officers responsible for their actions and interactions with the public. The individual continues to challenge the officers' behavior and the legality of their actions. The female officer reiterates their authority, causing the individual to assert that they have no right to trespass on their rights. The determination to defend their rights and record the encounter underscores the individual's commitment to transparency and accountability. While this scenario showcases the power of silent protest, it also highlights the challenges that can arise when individuals assert their rights in the face of law enforcement officers who may be unfamiliar with or resistant to such assertiveness.
The gentleman right there that called me.
Damn right.
Are you serious?
They just called me.
Are you?
The Columbia, South Carolina Police Department fired the officer today, calling his actions on the video inexcusable.
In this third scenario, we find an individual who is peacefully recording a protest in a public event with their smartphone. As they capture footage, they are approached by a law enforcement officer who inquires about their purpose for filming. The individual calmly explains that they are documenting the event, emphasizing their right to do so in a public space. The officer appears somewhat uneasy and questions whether they have a permit to record. The individual promptly responds, citing First Amendment rights that protect the freedom of the press and expression in public spaces without requiring a permit. As the situation unfolds, a second officer arrives on the scene. They inquire about the individual's identification and purpose for recording. The individual, aware of their rights, asks whether they are being detained or if they are free to leave. This question underscores the importance of law enforcement officers having reasonable suspicion to detain an individual or request identification. The first officer, acknowledging that there is no suspicion of any crime, informs the individual that they are free to leave. The individual chooses to stay and continue recording, emphasizing the right to observe and document events in public spaces, especially when they involve matters of public interest. The second officer, however, remains persistent and asks the individual to provide their identification. The individual responds by firmly stating that they will comply with the request only if they are legally obligated to do so. The officer must then clarify whether the request for identification is based on reasonable suspicion of criminal activity or merely a request. This scenario highlights the importance of understanding the nuances of when and how law enforcement officers can request identification. The individual's insistence on clarity and adherence to their rights results in a constructive dialogue rather than an escalation of tension. The encounter continues with the second officer explaining that they are merely trying to maintain the peace and ensure safety during the event. The individual acknowledges the officer's duty, but reinforces their own responsibility to uphold their rights. The situation ultimately de-escalates as the officers recognize that the individual is well informed about their rights and willing to cooperate within the bounds of the law. The officers conclude the interaction, and the individual continues to document the event without further interference. Interactions between individuals and law enforcement officers can be complex, often characterized by a delicate balance between asserting one's rights and respecting perceived authority. In all three scenarios, a common thread emerges. Individuals who are aware of their rights, confident in asserting them, and respectful in their communication can influence the trajectory of the encounter. While confrontations can potentially arise, a commitment to respectful engagement within the confines of the law can lead to positive outcomes. At the same time, the responsibility of law enforcement agencies to educate their officers on citizens' rights is crucial in ensuring that interactions remain lawful and respectful. Training officers to recognize and respect these rights is fundamental in fostering transparency and accountability. The three scenarios collectively emphasize the need for ongoing dialogue and education. Public awareness of rights, clear communication, and professional conduct by law enforcement officers are vital to maintaining respectful, lawful, and constructive interactions, where the protection of rights and the preservation of public safety coexist harmoniously. Ultimately, these scenarios highlight the need for ongoing dialogue and education to ensure that interactions between individuals and law enforcement officers remain lawful, respectful, and constructive, with the protection of rights and the maintenance of public safety at the forefront of every encounter.